Epping Forest, just a few miles outside of London, has long been a place of both natural beauty and dark mystery, with its dense woodlands, gnarled ancient trees, and patches of impenetrable darkness. It has been the subject of local legends for centuries. Some say it's haunted by spirits of the past. Others tell tales of people who enter but never return. Screams echo through the trees, but they are heard only by those within. To the outside world, the forest is eerily silent. Drawn by stories of paranormal phenomena and an insatiable thirst for adventure, a group of 7 friends decided to spend a weekend camping in Epping Forest. They were a tight-knit group. James, the fearless leader; Emily, his girlfriend, curious and sharp-minded; Daniel, the skeptic, who believed everything had a logical explanation; Grace, the sensitive one, often attuned to energies others could not feel; Tom, the jokester who could make light of any situation; Sarah, quiet and thoughtful but with a secret fascination for the macabre; and Luke, the new addition to the group, eager to prove his worth. It was a chilly autumn afternoon when the group arrived at the forest's edge. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark heart of the forest. The trees, with their twisted branches and dense foliage, created a canopy that blocked out most of the fading light. "Creepy place," Tom said with a grin as he shouldered his backpack. "I like it," James chuckled. "Don't tell me you're scared already." "Nah," Tom replied. "Just feels weird, you know?" Emily glanced at Grace, who was staring into the forest with a furrowed brow. "You okay?" she asked softly. Grace nodded slowly, but didn't look away. "I'm fine, just... there's something about this place. It feels heavy." "Come on," Daniel scoffed. "It's just a forest, nothing to be scared of." As they moved deeper into the woods, the thick undergrowth and tangled branches seemed to close in around them. The air grew colder, and the wind carried with it a low, almost inaudible hum that sent shivers down their spines. Despite Daniel's skepticism, a sense of unease began to settle over the group. "Let's find a good spot to set up camp," James said, trying to sound upbeat. "We'll build a fire, have some dinner, and tell ghost stories." They trekked deeper into the forest, and after what felt like an eternity, they found a small clearing surrounded by towering oaks. They set up their tents, gathered some wood, and soon had a fire crackling in the center of the camp. As night fell, the forest seemed to come alive with strange noises. The crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl were joined by rustling in the underbrush and the faint sound of footsteps that seemed to come from nowhere. "You hear that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide. "Probably just animals," Daniel said dismissively, but even he seemed a little on edge. Grace sat close to the fire, her eyes scanning the darkness. "It's not just animals," she murmured. "There's something else out there." Tom threw a stick into the fire, sending a shower of sparks into the night. "Spooky stories already? We just got here." "Not stories," Grace replied. "It's a feeling like we're not alone." James tried to lighten the mood. "All right, enough of the creepy talk. Who's got a good ghost story?" Emily, always up for a scare, leaned in closer to the fire. "I've got one. It's about this very forest." The group quieted down, intrigued. Even Daniel seemed interested, despite his earlier dismissiveness. "They say that people have been disappearing in Epping Forest for centuries," Emily began. "There are stories dating back to the Middle Ages about travelers who entered the woods and were never seen again. Some say it's the spirits of those who died here, lost souls looking for company. Others believe the forest itself is alive, a living entity that traps people within its grasp, feeding off their fear." As she spoke, the wind picked up, and the trees seemed to creak and groan as if reacting to her words. "They say you can hear the screams of the lost if you listen closely," she continued, "but only if you're inside the forest. To those outside, it's as if nothing happened." A sudden, loud snap of a branch echoed through the clearing, causing everyone to jump. "Jesus!" Luke exclaimed, his face pale. "What was that?" "Probably just a deer or something," James said, though his voice lacked conviction. But as the night wore on, the strange sounds grew louder. The rustling in the bushes seemed to be circling their camp, and faint, almost imperceptible whispers drifted through the air. Grace's face grew paler by the minute. "I don't like this," she whispered. "Something's wrong here." "Come on, Grace," Daniel said, though he too was glancing nervously into the darkness. "You're just spooking yourself out." But Grace shook her head. "No, it's the forest. It's like it's alive, like it knows we're here." As the fire died down to embers, the group finally decided to turn in for the night. They retreated to their tents, but sleep did not come easily. The wind howled outside, carrying with it those eerie whispers that seemed to grow louder with each passing hour. Around midnight, James awoke to the sound of a scream. It was distant but unmistakable, a high-pitched wail that seemed to echo through the trees. He sat up, heart pounding, and looked around. The others were stirring in their tents, clearly having heard it too. "Did you guys hear that?" Emily whispered, her face pale in the dim light of the lantern. "It was probably just an animal," Daniel said, though his voice was shaky. "No," Grace whispered. "That was a person." Suddenly, another scream tore through the night, closer this time. The group huddled together, fear etched on their faces. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice trembling. James nodded. "Yeah, let's pack up and go. This place is giving me the creeps." They quickly began to dismantle their tents and gather their belongings. But as they moved about the campsite, they realized something horrifying. No matter which direction they looked, everything seemed the same. The trees, the undergrowth, the twisted branches. It was as if the forest was shifting around them, closing in. "I can't find the path," Tom said, panic rising in his voice. "We came from over there, didn't we?" "No," Luke replied, his eyes darting around. "We came from that way." They argued back and forth, but no one could agree. Every direction looked identical, as if the forest itself was playing tricks on them. James tried to stay calm. "Okay, everyone, let's just pick a direction and start walking. We have to get out of here." They chose a path and began to walk, the beams of their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The forest was unnaturally silent now, save for the sound of their footsteps crunching on the underbrush. The trees seemed to loom over them, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out to grab them. After what felt like hours of walking, they stumbled into a clearing and froze. It was the same clearing where they had set up camp. This isn't possible," Emily stammered. "We've been walking straight this whole time." "It's the forest," Grace said, her voice filled with a dreadful certainty. "It won't let us leave." Daniel shook his head, refusing to believe it. "No, we must have just gotten turned around. We'll try again." They picked another direction and started walking once more, but after another hour, they found themselves back in the same clearing. Panic set in. They began to run, choosing paths at random, desperate to find a way out. But every time, they ended up back in the same place. "I don't understand," Tom muttered, his voice filled with fear. "Why can't we leave?" "It's the forest," Grace repeated, tears streaming down her face. "It's keeping us here." James tried to stay calm, but even he was beginning to feel the grip of terror tightening around his heart. "All right, everyone, let's just take a break and think this through." They sat down in the clearing, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The whispers in the trees seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as if the forest was taunting them. Suddenly, a loud, piercing scream echoed through the trees, closer than ever. The group jumped to their feet, their eyes wide with terror. "That was no animal," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. James nodded, his face pale. "We need to move. Now." They began to move again, this time with no clear direction. Fear and exhaustion had taken over, and their minds were clouded with panic. The forest seemed to shift around them, twisting and turning, leading them deeper into its dark heart. Hours passed, and the screams continued, now accompanied by strange, ghostly laughter that sent chills down their spines. The group was falling apart, their fear turning to hysteria. "I can't take this anymore," Tom shouted, tears streaming down his face. "We're never going to get out of here." "Don't say that," Emily snapped, her voice trembling. "We'll find a way, we have to." But deep down, they all knew she was just trying to keep them calm. The forest had them in its grip, and it wasn't going to let go. Suddenly, Daniel stopped, his eyes wide with terror. "Did you see that?" he whispered. "See what?" James asked, his voice tense. Daniel pointed into the darkness. There, in the trees, I saw a figure watching us. The group turned to look, but there was nothing there, only the impenetrable darkness and the ever-present whispers. You're just seeing things, Sarah said, though she didn't sound convinced. But then they heard it, a soft rustling in the bushes, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Someone or something was out there watching them. Run, James shouted, and they took off, sprinting through the underbrush, their hearts pounding in their chests. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees growing denser and the path more treacherous. They stumbled and fell, branches clawing at their clothes and skin, but they kept running, driven by a primal fear they had never known before. Suddenly, Luke screamed and fell to the ground, clutching his leg. "Help me!" he cried, his voice filled with pain. James and Emily rushed to his side, but when they saw his leg, they recoiled in horror. It was twisted at an unnatural angle, the bone protruding through the skin. "Oh my God," Emily whispered, her face pale. "We need to set it," James said, trying to keep calm. "Tom, give me your belt. We'll use it as a tourniquet." Tom handed over his belt, his hands shaking. James and Emily worked quickly, but Luke's screams echoed through the trees, louder and more desperate with each passing second. "Please, hurry," Luke begged, his face contorted in pain. "We're trying," James replied, but his voice was shaking. As they worked, the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches swaying as if in anticipation. Suddenly, a low, guttural growl echoed through the clearing. The group froze, their eyes darting around in panic. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, a dark shape emerged from the trees, a hulking, shadowy figure with glowing eyes that seemed to burn with an unnatural light. "Run!" James shouted, and they took off, leaving Luke behind. "No, don't leave me!" Luke screamed. But his cries were drowned out by the growl of the creature. As they ran, they heard a blood-curdling scream, a scream that could only have come from Luke, but they didn't stop. They couldn't. The forest was alive with terror, and they had to get away. They ran until they could run no more, collapsing in a heap in another small clearing. Their breaths came in ragged gasps, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. "What was that thing?" Emily gasped, her eyes wide with terror. "I don't know," James replied, his voice hoarse. "But we can't stop. We have to keep moving." But as they tried to stand, they realized something horrifying. The clearing was the same one they had just left, the same twisted trees, the same gnarled roots, the same place where Luke had been taken. "We're back where we started," Tom whispered, his voice filled with dread. "No," Grace said, shaking her head. "It's not possible." But it was. The forest had brought them back, and there was no sign of Luke, only a dark stain on the ground where he had been. "We're trapped," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "We're never getting out of here." James refused to believe it. "No, we can't think like that. We'll find a way. We just have to keep going." But the forest was relentless. No matter which way they turned, no matter how far they ran, they always ended up back in the same clearing. The whispers grew louder, now accompanied by ghostly laughter and distant screams. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. "I can't take it anymore," Tom muttered, his eyes wide with terror. "I'm losing my mind." Grace, who had been quiet for a long time, suddenly stood up. "We're not going to make it out of here, are we?" she asked, her voice strangely calm. James didn't know how to answer. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her they would find a way, but he couldn't. He didn't believe it himself. "I'm not going to die here," Grace said, her voice firm. "I won't let it take me." Before anyone could stop her, she turned and ran into the darkness. "Grace, no!" Emily shouted, but it was too late. They heard her footsteps fading away, followed by a sudden, piercing scream, then silence. The group was now down to 5. They huddled together, the weight of their situation pressing down on them like a vice. "We're not going to make it," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. James shook his head. "No, we have to keep trying. We can't just give up." But deep down he knew she was right. The forest was alive, and it had them in its grip. There was no escape. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the trees, It was Luke, or what was left of him. His face was pale, his eyes vacant, and his movements jerky, unnatural. "Luke?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. But Luke didn't respond. He moved toward them with a slow, deliberate gait, his eyes fixed on them with a blank, lifeless stare. "Stay back," James shouted, but Luke kept coming. Tom grabbed a stick from the ground and held it out in front of him like a weapon. "Don't come any closer." But Luke didn't stop. He moved closer and closer until he was right in front of them, and then, without warning, he lunged at Tom, his hands reaching out like claws. Tom screamed and swung the stick, but it passed right through Luke as if he were made of smoke. Luke's hands closed around Tom's neck, and he began to choke. "Help me!" Tom gasped, his face turning red. James and Emily rushed forward, trying to pull Luke off, but it was like fighting a ghost. Luke's grip was unbreakable, his strength inhuman. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Luke released Tom and vanished into the darkness, leaving Tom gasping for air on the ground. "What the hell was that?" Daniel asked, his voice filled with fear. "I don't know," James replied, his voice shaking, "but we need to keep moving." They moved deeper into the forest, the whispers growing louder with each step. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches reaching out like claws. "I can't do this anymore," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with despair. James turned to her, his face grim. "We have to keep going. We can't stop now." But it was too late. The forest had them in its grip, and it wasn't going to let go. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet began to shake, and the trees swayed as if caught in a violent storm. The whispers grew louder, now a deafening roar that filled their ears and minds with a terrible, maddening sound. The group clung to each other, their faces filled with fear and confusion. And then, without warning, the ground split open beneath them, and they were swallowed by the darkness. James awoke to find himself alone in the dark. The whispers had stopped, and the forest was eerily silent. He tried to stand, but his body was weak, his limbs heavy with exhaustion. "Emily?" he called out, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Daniel? Sarah?" But there was no answer. He was alone. He tried to remember how he had gotten here, but his mind was foggy, his memories distant and unclear. All he knew was that he was lost in the forest, and there was no way out. He stumbled through the darkness, his eyes straining to see in the dim light. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out to grab him. And then he heard it. A faint, distant scream. It was Emily. He took off in the direction of the sound, his heart pounding in his chest. He ran through the darkness, his breath coming in ragged gasps, until he stumbled into a small clearing. There, in the center of the clearing, was Emily. She was standing perfectly still, her eyes fixed on something in the distance. "Emily!" James called out, rushing toward her, but she didn't respond. She just stood there, her eyes vacant and her face expressionless. James reached her side and grabbed her arm, but she didn't move. It was like she was in a trance. "Emily, please!" James begged, his voice filled with desperation. "We have to get out of here." But Emily didn't respond. She just stared into the darkness, her eyes blank and lifeless. And then James heard it, a soft, low whisper that seemed to come from all around them. It was a voice, but not one he recognized. It was cold and cruel, filled with malice and hatred. "Leave," the voice hissed. "Leave this place and never return." James felt a chill run down his spine, but he didn't move. He couldn't. He was frozen in place, his body paralyzed with fear, and then the forest began to close in around them. The trees leaned closer, their branches reaching out like claws. The ground beneath their feet began to shake, and the air grew thick with a terrible, suffocating darkness. James tried to scream, but no sound came out. He could only watch in horror as the darkness closed in, swallowing them whole. And then, everything went black. The sun rose over Epping Forest, casting a warm, golden light over the trees. The forest was calm, serene, and quiet. There was no sign of the 7 friends who had entered the woods the night before. No tents, no campfire, no footprints, nothing. The forest had taken them, just as it had taken so many others before. and it would continue to take more, feeding off their fear and despair, drawing them deeper into its dark heart, where no one could hear their screams. To the outside world, Epping Forest was just another patch of woodland. But to those who knew its secrets, it was a place of darkness and terror, a place where the past and present collided, and where the lost were never found. And so the forest waited, its whispers echoing through the trees, ready to claim its next victims. For in Epping Forest, the shadows never slept and the darkness never died. Epping Forest remains an enigma, a haunting blend of beauty and terror. To the casual visitor, it's a serene escape from the bustle of nearby London, its trees whispering the secrets of centuries past. But beneath its tranquil surface lies a dark heart, a labyrinth where the lost wander in eternal twilight, their screams swallowed by an unforgiving silence. The forest's allure is undeniable, drawing in those who seek adventure, mystery, or the thrill of the unknown. Yet, for every tale told around a campfire, there are countless more that end in silence. It's a place where the line between reality and the supernatural blurs, where time seems to stand still, and where escape is not guaranteed. Epping Forest waits, patient and unyielding, for those brave or foolish enough to enter its depths, a reminder that some mysteries are best left unsolved,